class. This is the lecture for Module 6, which is on virtue ethics. So just my usual beginning. So I want to say a few words about what we're doing for this module. I have included an additional reading assignment, which is not in your book, but I found it an open source copy of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. So I've uploaded that for you to read. And hopefully this lecture will give you kind of a solid grounding both before and after doing your reading. So we're trying to look at a few different examples of virtue ethics in this module. So the standard ones are Plato and Aristotle. But also, actually, Confucius really predates Plato and Aristotle. So I'm going to talk about Confucius a little bit too. And then we're going to contrast those ideas with the virtue ethics of Nietzsche. And so what I'd like you to do for this module, which is going to span a couple of weeks, is in the discussion you're really going to apply some of these ideas, and that then in the next week you're going to write an essay. So of course you'll be practicing writing different arguments for and against various virtue theories, and I'm hoping this is going to be a little bit more straightforward for all of you. So virtue ethics are ethics. Virtue ethics is not concerned with making rules. So in the study of virtue ethics, you can't simply ask the question, is it wrong to steal? Instead, you should ask the question, what would a virtuous person do? Would a virtuous person steal? Now, you might simply think yes, or you might say no, for different reasons. So the concept of virtue ethics really implies a shared worldview and a shared definitions of ethics. Confucius, Plato, and Aristotle may be in alignment with each other. There's some interesting similarities between the East and West. Nietzsche does not agree, however, with their views of virtue. So he'll be a nice contrast, kind of 19th century contrast. So here's a list of some virtues, and I'm sure you could add some more to the list. Temperance is often mentioned as a virtue. Benevolence, civility, compassion, conscientiousness, courage, courteousness, dependability, fairness, friendliness, generosity, honesty, justice, loyalty, moderation, patience, prudence, self-discipline, tolerance. What else would you add to the list of things that many people agree on? Many people agree on from all sorts of different cultures. So see if you can add to this list. It'll be a kind of an interesting test. So I have the same picture of Confucius from the last module, but I really want to point out that Confucius was writing about virtue and virtue ethics way before the Greek philosophers. So that's just an interesting side note, I think. So now notice, I'm bringing this up again, but Confucius' idea was that people, in order to be virtuous, you would avoid extremes. So he called that the doctrine of the mean, like the mathematical mean, the middle point between two extremes. He did say that what should rule human relationships is compassion and kindness or benevolence. He also saw that there was an ideal person. In Confucian worldview, they even have a name for the most virtuous person. And that person is called the Chunxi, who embodies Zhen, and often in Confucian culture is seen as a teacher. Now, Confucian ethics includes something very interesting. It's referred to as the silver rule. Do not do unto others what you do not want done to you. Do you think it's different or the same as the golden rule? Kind of an interesting question. Another one of there are many more Confucian ethics, but I just was giving you a smattering of them. So one is when, which is the idea that a cultivation of certain artistic disciplines like calligraphy and classical music enhances and elevates the human spirit. So consider these ideas are being promoted in China in the 6th century B.C.E. 6 centuries before the birth of Christ. So then you'll see just the interesting thing is some historians and religious scholars refer to this period as the Axis Age because it seems like there were some interesting things happening on the planet around the same time or within a similar time frame without any contact. So we have no evidence that Plato or Aristotle knew anything about Eastern philosophy. But Plato comes up with some ideas about what it means to be virtuous. Now, as we said before in a previous lecture, for Plato, the source of virtue comes from the ultimate form or the source which he calls the good. So if you are virtuous, it means you are striving for the good and being ruled by reason. So according to Plato, people have a 3-part or a tripart soul. So the soul is made up of someone's appetites. It's kind of like, it's actually almost like the Freudian idea of the id. And then the second part is the drives, which would be the Freudian corollary to the ego. And then the third part is the intellect, which would be corresponds roughly to what Freud called the superego. So what Plato proposes is that when a person is really governed by reason, they will demonstrate certain virtues. And what it means is that reason is controlling those 3 driving forces of the human being: the appetite, the drives, the intellect. So Plato says that temperance is an example of reason controlling appetite. And courage is an example of a virtue where reason is controlling the drives, the force to do. And wisdom is a virtue where reason is controlling the intellect. And then Plato adds on a 4th virtue, which results in a person when all 3 parts of the soul are in balance, where the soul is acting in obedience to reason. Very interesting. So in some sense, Aristotle is Plato's student, and so there's some similarities. They're pretty close together, just a little bit off. But rather than appealing to a form, Aristotle really is unique in that he talks about happiness, right? The whole concept of eudaimonia that we've talked about many times before from the beginning of the class. So eudaimonia, or happiness, is the highest form of the good. He wouldn't use the word form, the highest expression of the good. And happiness is both, has two parts to it. Happiness is enjoyment and pleasure, but it's also the exercise and development of the capacity to reason. So virtue is in fact the result of our ability to reason. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I think it's actually pretty easy to understand in the essay by Aristotle that you have in your reader, because he clearly distinguishes between intellectual virtue and moral virtue. So make sure you know the difference between those two. To Aristotle, specific moral virtues were identified as the mean between two extremes. Doesn't this sound like Confucius? Isn't that interesting? So, like Confucius, he talked about a virtuous behavior as being kind of a middle path. And when Aristotle talks about virtues, he always contrasts the two extremes that the virtue is a balancing act of. The other insight related to virtue and ethics that Aristotle identifies in his writings, chiefly the Nicomachean Ethics, is the idea of being two different types of ends. So the first end is an instrumental end. So an instrumental end is an act that's performed to achieve other ends, or a means to an end. So I want to help people who are suffering in Puerto Rico, and so I'm going to do what I can, and I'm doing this act to ultimately help them. So whatever it is that I'm doing or you're doing is actually an instrumental type of act. But there might be something an act which is performed for its own sake, which he would call an intrinsic end. Maybe some of you are kind or have certain ideas of things that you do just because that's what you do. Remember that when we get to Kantian ethics. Okay, so now we've looked at two Western and one Eastern virtue ethicists from way back. And now let's jump ahead to the 19th century and talk about Friedrich Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche often gets a bad rap, and honestly, some ethics books don't like to deal with him because he's so controversial. But I think that's ridiculous. I mean, you kind of have to understand what Nietzsche is talking about, and you'll find out you already have certain Nietzschean ideas in your vocabulary. So the first thing that Nietzsche disagrees with the ideas of humility and temperance as being virtuous. He says that moralities are social institutions, and there's basically just two types of morality. The first he calls slave morality. So you can already get the idea that slave morality is not well viewed by Nietzsche. He says it's exemplified by Christianity and the idea of turning the other cheek. So he actually sees this as an example of herd mentality. So humility, he says, is part of slave morality, and that's not a virtue to Nietzsche. He exemplifies the higher good, in his view, is the master morality, which is exemplified by nobles and aristocrats. This morality values egoism, intolerance, but they're also bound to a code of loyalty to their peers. And he says that it really is about a pursuit of excellence. And he says that when people are just following the group, they cannot become masters. They cannot become excellent. So that ultimately, human beings really need to do their best. Now, this is also a Nietzschean virtue, to do your best. And he says that actually there's a battle going on in the human spirit between the Apollonian and the Dionysian tendencies, which are related to the god Apollo and Dionysius. So Apollonian virtues include measure, order, and harmony, and the Dionysian virtues include excess, destruction, and creative power. And what he really saw is that slave morality, what he called slave morality, was attacking the fruits of Dionysian exploration, if you will. So there's another really interesting idea that kind of fits into his schema of what it means to be a virtuous person, and that is, he really believes that the enhancement of the human species only comes from aristocratic societies, or in a sense, it has to be a society that allows for excellence. So the primal life force he calls the will to power. And his example of the person who has achieved this, the highest expression of the will to power, he calls the Übermensch. So you can see a cartoon here of the Übermensch Nietzsche. So it's a cartoon of Nietzsche's face with a Superman outfit. And that is because one translation of this German word, Übermensch, is Superman. And so he really, he despises mediocrity and weak will. Now, I just want to say an interesting side note. Nietzsche actually thought that Jesus was a good example of an Übermensch, but Christianity kind of ruined it. It's very interesting. And he actually had all sorts of respect for certain people who were mathematicians and philosophers. He wasn't religious, and he didn't understand the herd mentality of Christianity. And ultimately, he says, you have to struggle. You have to struggle. So I was always amazed when I saw that Kelly Clarkson video of her song where she's basically singing Nietzsche. I just couldn't help but laugh, because I was just imagining what Friedrich Nietzsche would say listening to Kelly Clarkson. But the phrase, "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," is from Nietzsche. How many times have you said that or heard that? Did you know who was the author of that idea? So notice the huge contrast between the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche and those of Confucius, Plato, and Aristotle. So it's not an article that you have, but James Rachels, one of the authors that you've read before, wrote an article giving some general critiques of virtue ethics. So I thought that was interesting. And one of the things that he argues in this article is that virtue ethics is not a complete moral theory, because it does not completely answer why certain rules are in and of themselves ethical. So he says this is a basic problem. There's a basic problem of incompleteness. Virtue ethics still doesn't answer the question of why stealing is wrong. So the other thing is that virtue, he asks the question, is there a virtue that matches every morally good reason for doing something? I don't think there is. Okay, but now let's see if we can apply the idea of what would a virtue ethicist do if the virtue ethicist was giving counsel to a certain legislator who was deciding how to allocate funds for medical research. All right, say you're the legislator And you have to decide between funding AIDS research, cancer research, or Parkinson's research. So how would a virtue ethicist make that decision? Now, some people might say, well, maybe you should do cancer research because that would help the most people. But then that's not a virtue ethicist kind of response. That's a utilitarian kind of response. So I'd be curious to see what you think about this. Maybe you can play around with it. But you have to really think about how a virtue ethicist would approach certain moral dilemmas. And you might want to say whether you're an Aristotelian ethicist, virtue ethicist, or a Nietzschean, right? So, because a Nietzschean virtue ethicist might say, what will give you the most glory and power, right? Interesting. So I look forward to reading your work this week and next week.